Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Stephanie Sandala. This is a skill sharing conversation on reclassifying library materials, and I'm so thrilled to have here with me today Catherine Oliver from Montclair State University and Lisa Thornton from Seton Hall University, and they're going to share their advice with you. We're going to have plenty of time at the end for questions, comments, feedback, and sharing any of your experiences. But before we do that, Catherine and Lisa have some quick PowerPoints to go over with you to share their experiences on reclassifying materials and answer any questions you may have. So Catherine, feel free to go ahead and get started.
Hi, my name is Catherine Oliver. I am the head for cataloging, metadata, and archival services at Montclair State University. Before I took this job, I was the metadata and cataloging services librarian at Northern Michigan University. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about a very small scale reclassification project we did there, about separating Holocaust denial materials from the rest of the collection. Stephanie, next slide. So the first question is always, should we reclassify? Because, I don't know if your library is like my library, but we have tons of stuff that was classified under the wrong number or obsolete numbers. And if we wanted to, we could probably just reclassify all day long. But most of us don't want to. So how do we decide when we should reclassify? Next slide. Well, first of all, check to see whether there's a real need. Is this an area where patrons are getting confused? Patrons are being offended. Patrons aren't finding what they need. I want to differentiate here a bit between subject heading reanalysis projects and reclassification projects. Obviously, both of these are important. Both of these take a lot of time. But since the demise of the card catalog, a subject reanalysis project, it takes staff time, yes, but it can be often very quickly done, especially if it's just sort of a replacement, if it's a question of replacing one subject heading with the other. A reclassification project, on the other hand, involves a lot of staff time. It involves physical materials. It involves buying new labels, remaking new labels. So a lot of times you want to think more about a reclassification project than you do about a subject heading reanalysis project. So when you're deciding, should we reclassify or not, I advise you to consult with multiple stakeholders. Talk with technical services staff about whether their workload and whether they have time for such a project. Talk with public services staff and see what particular issues patrons are having, whether there's a sort of pattern to them, what the main issues are, and talk with administration and get their buy-in. Next slide, please. So Northern Michigan University, or NMU, where I worked before, one of its great strengths is its Holocaust collection. Thanks to an anonymous donor, the Lydia M. Olson Library at NMU has a very strong collection in Holocaust literature. This includes materials that deny the Holocaust. And this is where we were having a bit of an issue. Next slide, please. So what is Holocaust denial literature? Well, to quote from ClassWeb, Holocaust denial literature verb tenses, works that seek to diminish the scale and significance of the Holocaust or assert that it did not occur. Now, Holocaust denial literature is separated from other genuine work about the Holocaust in the Library of Congress classification and in the Library of Congress subject headings. This was not always the case. Until 1997, works that denied the Holocaust and works about denial of the Holocaust were both assigned the same subject heading, Holocaust Jewish 1939 to 1945 errors and inventions, and they weren't separated from other materials. In 1997, two new Library of Congress subject headings were created: Holocaust denial literature, i.e. work that denies the Holocaust, and Holocaust denial, work about work that denies the Holocaust. And yes, I realize that those two subject headings are not very intuitive, but those were the ones that were created. And both of these subject headings got their own designated classification numbers. So at this point, the Library of Congress made the decision that work that denied the Holocaust would be placed in a different area than genuine work about the Holocaust. Is this true of other historical atrocities? Only the Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor, only that also has a specific classification number for works that deny that the Holodomor existed, and a classification number for works that denied that the Holodomor happened, and works about denial of the Holodomor. Other genocides that have occurred in human history do not have this set up. Next slide, please. So, having Holocaust denial literature in a scholarly Holocaust collection in a university that is very undergraduate serving, it presents some issues. While some Holocaust denial literature is very easily recognizable to anyone as just straight up hate and poison, some of it tries to disguise itself as sort of scholarly literature. The authors are just asking questions. The publishers have names like Institute for Historical Review, which contains a lot of words that undergraduate students are hearing. And because of that, it can be hard to tell at a quick glance whether something is Holocaust denial literature or not. Even for someone like me who processes Holocaust denial literature, it sometimes took some close reading to figure it out. So because of that, there is a danger in having Holocaust denial literature intermixed with the collection, in my point of view, and clearly also in the Library of Congress's point of view. Also, sometimes, while the subject heading makes it very clear that Holocaust denial literature is not just material that denies the Holocaust ever happened, it's also material that tries to minimize the Holocaust. And yet, sometimes books that minimize the Holocaust tend to fall through the cracks. Also, Holocaust denial material that focuses on a particular aspect of the Holocaust can fall through the cracks. For example, at NMU, we had a book that claimed that the existence of the Dutch author Anne Frank is a myth, that Anne Frank herself did not exist. And because that was on such a specific aspect of the Holocaust, when I saw the record, it had not been cataloged as Holocaust denial, and it was classified with other works about Anne Frank. So sometimes if a Holocaust denial book has a specific enough focus, it can slip through the cracks. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So it was clear to me from talking to public services staff, talking to technical services staff, consulting with administration, that because of our focus on the Holocaust as a scholarly topic at Northern Michigan University, it was very, very important that all our books on Holocaust denial literature have the Holocaust denial literature classification number and subject heading, and that they not have any subject headings besides the Holocaust denial literature subject heading, that it be made very clear to patrons what these books were. So my question was, how do I find this material that I should reclassify? I wasn't quite sure how many of these books we had. I wasn't quite sure how to find all the Holocaust denial literature material. So I turned to experts. Next slide, please, Stephanie. I went to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum site. They have a Holocaust encyclopedia, and their Holocaust encyclopedia has an article that I think at the time was called the Holocaust Denial Timeline. If you look for it now, it is called Holocaust Denial Key Dates, and it has been updated. I should state for the record that this project occurred, I believe, in 2015. So Anything after that might not be included in my presentation, but I'm just going to be talking about how things were in 2015. So looking at this timeline created by the scholars at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I came up with a list of works, authors, and publishers that are known to be Holocaust deniers. I'm including a list here. Some of these books are not often cataloged as Holocaust denial, for example, the David Irving book. But I decided to follow the Holocaust Memorial Museum's guideline on this and also categorize that as Holocaust denial. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So this is what we did. I made a list of those publishers and those authors. I did a search of our catalog. I came up with all the relevant books I could. When I found a new, to me, publisher or author, I did another search to make sure I was collecting all the materials. As it turned out, it wasn't too many materials, which was good. So we could make a priority of getting this done as quickly as possible. And that is what we did. So the next few slides are just the current D804.35 holdings for Northern Michigan University. D804.35 is the Holocaust denial literature classification number. So that was our project. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. That was really, really great. I see Kelly has a question, if we could answer that briefly, about a question as to whether a library should retain denial literature and put it in a collection development policy, which I think might be a good idea. Was that part of NMU's policy?
It was. The donor felt that by retaining Holocaust denial literature in the collection, it would be a way for scholars to study this literature and to see the lies and hatred that led to the Holocaust in the first place. So it did fit into our collection development policy. I imagine that a lot of libraries would not retain this material, and I would not blame them in the slightest, which is why so much of this material required original cataloging.
Okay, great, thank you. And now, Lisa, I will share your slides.
Right, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Catherine. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, although I'm the acquisitions and collections librarian at Seton Hall University, I'm going to talk about my previous work in public libraries, and I know at least one of my former colleagues is here, so hello. And just to kind of give us a balance, I know we have a mix of academic and public librarians here. Some of your names I recognize that have attended a previous presentation I did on the optional arrangement for the Religion 200, so I'll do a little bit about that, but I also wanted to talk about some smaller projects, just reclassification projects where you're looking for, as Catherine mentioned, just to serve your community better. Are they people having trouble finding things? What works for your community? So there were a few small things that we did while I was at Scotch Plains Public Library. One was I began to build up our, on the collection development side, graphic medicine titles. So that we decided we were going to start collecting in that area a little more in our collection, just to have a different way of presenting health topics to our population. And so we had some graphic medicine titles that were interfiled just in our in the nonfiction section of our graphic novel collection. But a lot of our patrons, we have a select set, right, of patrons that kind of go towards the graphic novels. And so some people think, oh, I'm not interested in that section. And so we moved the collection to be interfiled with the regular nonfiction section, so that if someone is looking for materials related to, for example, this book, Parkinson's, there's also some graphic novels, just a different way to present that information, whether it's for someone who has Parkinson's or has a family member who was recently diagnosed with Parkinson's, or just someone who wants to learn a little bit more about that disease in a different format. So that was one of the decisions that we made. And because the collection, I was sort of building it up, we only had a few, it was easy to move what we had and then start fresh. in this way with this classification. I will say that some people in sort of the consumer health don't prefer this method. They like they like it to be with graphic novels. So I think it is just an example of what works for your community. And we were promoting the consumer health collection a lot. We were doing a lot of work in those areas, both programming and with the collection. And so it was a good time for us to make that move. Another section that we worked on encompasses our travel section. The travel section at Scotch Plains Public Library, as I imagine at many public libraries, is very popular. People are going on trips and they want to take out books on those regions without having to purchase them, or just to decide what type of book they'd prefer before they make their own purchase. And so because that is a popular collection in the region, we decided to take the hiking books that were in outdoor recreation that were specifically for hiking in certain areas. And we moved those into that geographic location for travel. So for example, if a family was taking a family trip to North Carolina, they could also find hiking books on that region and maybe add that into their travel agenda. We also took travel diaries and memoirs. One of the things that we found was that our patrons were looking for travel diaries, not necessarily about the place, but by particular authors. And so it didn't matter to them what location they were from. They really just wanted to read this particular author. And so we moved all of our travel diaries and memoirs together and left the travel type section for hiking and travel books, like starting at 914. So the other one was the adoption of our optional arrangement for religion on the 200. So I have given a presentation on that previously. I did just publish in Cataloging and Classification Quarterly, sorry, the process that we use to do that. So I'll put a link to the article in the chat, but the slides from that presentation are also available online. So I can put a link to that as well. Next slide, please, Stephanie. But once we did make these changes, it's important, right, to document them in your local cataloging practices so that as books come in, people know how to, you've done this reclassification, but for example, at Scotch Plains, books already come in to us with the Dewey classification number on them for the nonfiction. And so they do need to be relabeled. So we did create a documentation for local cataloging practices. This is just a little excerpt about the part that I've talked about, but it did encompass other areas. So for religion, we had every staff member who cataloged had a link to the alternate Dewey crosswalk that was created by Emily McDonald from Lawrence Public Library in Kansas. And everyone had kind of a copy of that at their desk. And they could also access it through her Google Doc. For the travel essays and memoirs, as I said, we kind of standardized where it would be 910.4, regardless of the location. And then just some other information. Hiking books, it was, placing hiking books with travel guides for the related area, as opposed to in the 796s. And so that's just a way on the other side to make sure that people know how things are done. For these examples, obviously I'm not at that library anymore, but this is a way for them to keep up. And if they make any more changes, I'm sure those have gone into the local cataloging practices. So that's it for me.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. That was a great presentation too. And I know, Lisa, you mentioned that you're going to put some links in the chat.
Yeah,
That'd be great for people.
Right now.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. And if anyone has any questions for Catherine or Lisa, or comments about reclassifying materials at your library, or just feedback or any suggestions, we're open to any of your thoughts. You can feel free to put any comments, questions in the chat, or unmute yourself and feel free to chime in. It's a very informal conversation. And Catherine and Lisa, thank you again for that great presentation. Really, really helpful for both of you.
Thank you for asking us, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you,
Of course.
Stephanie. And we're happy to hear about what other libraries have done. You know, I'm sure most of you have done other, whether they're small or big, reclassification projects. Shout out to all the NJLA Technical Services and Collection Development Committee people that are here. I see a bunch of your names, so I know you've done some too.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
I'm Natalie. I'm from Highland Park Public Library. I'm one of the adult services librarians. We're very small. We don't have any cataloging staff specifically. It's just me and my colleague. And neither of us is really like a specialist. So I've just been kind of like learning as I go. And I'm really excited. Thank you so much for doing this conversation because I've been thinking a lot about it and haven't really like been talking with a lot of other librarians about it. So my question is, as I'm doing these small projects, as Lisa said, it's really important to document what I'm doing for people in the future, for my other colleagues or whatever. Could people who are here, like, would you be willing to share examples of your like internal documentation guides? Because I don't really know anything about what format that should take or like what, just like examples of formats or if there's like a template or something so that I can make sure I'm making it in a legible way or like in a standard way.
That sounds great. I don't think we have any formal documentation here. I'd only recently started my job, so take that with a grain of salt. But I'd be excited to hear what anyone else has. So if anyone else wants to drop a link in the chat, please do. I would love to see it.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone from TCNJ is here, but I know they have their cataloging policies on their website. As I find all these links that I mentioned, I'll just find them and pop them into the chat as well. We don't have ours open yet. We're actually building that up. I have only been in my job for a year and a half. And I've been working with our team here to get our documentation set. We had a big change in our staffing here. And so we're realizing that we really need it because there isn't a lot there for us to go back to. So yeah, it is absolutely important.
In a presentation about catalogers' judgment, you need at least one judgy cat.
Yes, exactly. She is really
It's so
judgmental
true.
for a young cat. So it's true. Yes, but Lisa, thank you for that link too.
Yeah,
And anyone is
that's-
also welcome to share questions, comments, feedback. We're happy to hear from you.
We'd also love to hear about any other reparative cataloging projects people are doing. If you're working on local subject heading projects, author names, anything like that, we'd love to have a conversation about that.
So I have a question and then I'll add a little bit onto that. What this kind of amplifies and builds on the previous question is, what kind of documentation did you inherit in your job to know what was expected, or how did you approach, like, you know, this is the problem and we need to address it?
I would say like a lot of technical services departments in academic libraries, NMU struggled with documentation, and I don't think I'm throwing my former employer under the bus because I don't think we were alone. There
Right.
was a wiki, there was a SharePoint site. A lot of people had made really valiant and great efforts, and then sort of those disappeared into the mist. When we became a Google campus, that helped because Google Docs and Sheets were so commonly shared among people that those felt like they had perhaps a kind of illusory stability. So a lot of the documentation, for example, for this project was maintained in Google Docs that were then shared with other relevant stakeholders so they could see the progress of it. I know also my dean was very supportive, and she enjoyed having the documentation because it was something that she brought up to higher levels of university administration to talk about projects that were going on in the library to improve service to patrons.
Did you inherit anything that was helpful?
I did inherit helpful material, but not on this particular topic.
Gotcha.
My predecessor left me a lot of useful files about, for example, systems, but I don't think there had been any sort of major reclassification projects at my institution, except for our juvenile fiction collection, which had a very a locally grown classification system aimed at keeping it in author and then aimed at keeping it alphabetical by author and then by title. And unfortunately, I think not unfortunately, fortunately, the collection grew beyond its original purview. So
Yeah.
books there were constantly being reclassified. So there was already sort of a cultural understanding in the university that sometimes you just have to relabel a book. But aside from that, no, I didn't get a lot of documentation from my predecessors. Although I did get helpful documentation in other ways.
Yeah, and I know for me as well, there was some bits of documentation in different places. We're a Microsoft campus, so we use SharePoint. So we did have some, but the metadata coordinator has been working on building that up, the documentation, and so we have it in a shared in SharePoint. It helps a lot. But in my old library, at Scotch Plains, we were Google, so we had the documentation was in a shared Google Doc.
So I have like following up on this, and then another question. One question open to like, I guess everyone here is thinking about what documentation would be helpful to inherit. I am, and I'll preface this, I am work at a research center at Rutgers at the Center for State Health Policy, and I am a department of one. So I'm trying to take what I've inherited and make sure when I eventually do move on that I leave appropriate documentation. And because we are a social science health research center, I'm also curious if anyone else here is in that realm and has been working with mesh terms, because there are some, again, like larger changes in society and terminology that haven't quite caught up in that area.
Yeah, Lisa or Catherine, do you have any experience with either? And anyone else is welcome to chime in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was hoping, that we got this collection of librarians, so hopefully.
Yes.
This is definitely not this is possibly the most labor-intensive way to create documentation. But I have benefited so much from articles and journals published by other catalogers about reparative cataloging projects. They've given me ideas. They've been very helpful to me to sort of show to the powers that be and be like, look what these other catalogers are doing. Can I do this too, please? And of course, while publishing in a journal takes a lot of work, it's definitely a way of sharing your documentation with a lot of people. I realize that might not be helpful, but that has been a big experience for me.
Yeah, and it's funny because that's actually one of the reasons that I published what we did at Scotch Plains, because I think it's Emily McDonald did such a good job. She wrote that's how I learned about the alternate Dewey. She had sort of documented on the Dewey blog, which if you are a Dewey librarian, you love that stuff. The Dewey blog is great. And so she had done an article there. I know she's presenting at PLA with some other librarians that have also done the alternate arrangement. But I actually did the article because I didn't see much from that public library perspective, which kind of makes sense, because in academia you often have to publish, and in the public library you're running around with your hair on fire. And so it's but I think that it's really helpful to see what other libraries have done, because I really feel like we kind of followed what Emily had done and just sort of tailored it to what was needed for our collection. And I think that can be really helpful. And I know when we presented for NJLA last year through the technical services and collection development section, TCNJ and Ryder were also there talking about some of their end cutter work. And so I think when we do projects, I think having something like this is important for everyone to just kind of keep discussing, because we sometimes think our projects are so small and they don't like, oh, I just did this little thing. But I think if we all just talk about and put out there, whether it's a blog or whatever, a presentation on this little thing that we did, I think that really helps document for the rest of us to build our own documentation for our own libraries when we want to do processes. So I definitely encourage that.
Yes,
Great.
I also want to shout out TCNJ and Ryder for the end cutter work. Montclair actually used their work as a basis for our own reclassification project last year.
Yeah, they both did great work, and they did very different ways of tackling the same project, which I think is really helpful depending on what your staffing is and what your skills are.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for those great questions, Christina. And anyone else is welcome to chime in. Yeah, Kelly, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had a question, well, more, I don't know if it's a question or observation. I work at Camden County Library. I've been head of technical services for just a few years now. And anything that we do that you sort of change, like you said, you know, changing where the travel books or anything, and then you make sure you document it. We use, you know, with Baker and Taylor, it comes in pre-processed with the call number. So you've got to make sure, I hesitate to do that because then it's justifying to the powers that be that we're not, you know, we're paying for the processing and then we're taking all these, making sure we get all the books and looking at all of them. So has anybody ever, you know, that's a hesitation there as to when we change those kind of things.
Yes, definitely. And I think that is something to be taken into consideration, depending on, you know, what size of the collection is that you're changing the numbers for. I know they are trying to work on getting at least the alternate religion to be more prevalent in the records, so that maybe we'll get to a place where you can ask for, you know, the other number that would already be in that record. Because I am seeing it sometimes in there. For the other ones that are just more custom, I know at our library, even just with like our mystery books, I know we had Ingram, but we would get anything fiction was just fic and then the author's last name, right? So a lot of us have done those, you know, we forget that, like, that really, even though so many of us do that is like
The whole discussion as to whether it's fiction or mystery, it'll
right.
send you over the
Yes.
edge.
Exactly, Kelly. And so, you know, but the mystery we would do on our own, you know, just because. And so, yeah, sometimes you miss it because, you know, usually you don't if it's the hard boiled because it was like really like up there. But one of the things that we had done, and I'm not sure if they're still doing it, Allison, you could put it in the chat. But we had done, you know, when the books were unboxed, for example, with the religion, we would kind of put a Post-it note on it, like, hey, religion, you know, like, know that you got to change this one. Because we're all careful when we're going through and making sure that whatever that Baker and Taylor or Ingram put on there actually makes sense. Because of course they do make mistakes, but you're also, you know, churning books out. And so there is that. So I think it depends on, you know, for example, for the travel and the hiking, like it's so small. It's not a big cost of supplies. It's not a big extra staff work. It's not that big of a deal. But yeah, I can see. Oh, see, Allison says they're still doing that. Yay! I do think, you know, it is, but you do have to take it into consideration for sure. Great question, Kelly.
Like I said earlier, I think every library has big swaths of shelves where if you could just reclassify every item on that shelf, you would. So being able to sort of select a sort of limited project where you know that it's an immediate concern can help sell it, even if, you know, like almost all libraries, you have very few staff and less time and a great deal of stress.
I'll
So-
share that one way that I've justified spending a fair amount of time on reclassification projects in our small library is that um, it really helps me like maintain the collection and keep it updated and weed. Like when I came in, I felt like I could not even begin to weed or like figure out where the gaps were in like travel or cookbooks or health because the Dewey numbers were just like all over the place and I couldn't even tell like what we had. So I we had some like closures due to building stuff, and that was a good opportunity for me to work on this. And I know it is hard to find the time, but since I was able to like invest that time in it, then it was actually really easy to do a big weed and a big update and to like keep it, hopefully going forward, it will be a lot easier to keep it updated. So that could be something you could tell your admin of why it's worth the time, in addition to the benefits for the public, of course.
Oh, Patty Schmidt asks, has anyone created their own 650 subject terms for DEI purposes? I would love to hear an answer from anyone in the chat, but I also have my own story.
Yes, please feel free to share your story too.
So there was a book written, I cannot remember how many years ago it was, but the book is called Asexuality, the Invisible Orientation. And we copy cataloged it. And at that time, there was no Library of Congress subject heading for asexuality as a sexual orientation for human beings. So I think there was just a subject heading about asexuality in plant life. And a patron said, hey, what's up with the subject heading on this book? This book is about people. And I was like, yes. So we created 2 local subject headings, asexuality and asexual people, for this book. But because this bothered me so much, I decided that there really should be a Library of Congress subject heading on it. So I and my coworker Nell Ganin, who currently works at the Library of Congress, worked together to create a subject heading proposal and send it to the Library of Congress. And after much back and forth, it was approved. So now asexuality is a Library of Congress subject heading. This is another topic entirely, but it is possible to create your own Library of Congress subject heading. It can happen. And I was really happy that I was able to do that and work on that and serve our patrons better that way. So that's my story of creating local subject headings that are now no longer local. So maybe that was a wrong thing, but it started out as a local subject heading.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks, Catherine. And next month, we are having a follow-up of sorts on gender inclusive cataloging. So we probably will have some more scenarios like that. So in a follow-up email to this presentation, I'll send a registration info for that as well. So we'd love to have everyone come join us for that. We have a great guest speaker coming in to talk about, reclassifying at their library. So yeah, Kat, I'm happy to send that information to you. So yes, but thank you for that. I also wanted to highlight Jane's comment in the chat earlier. She says she gets their books pre-processed from Baker and Taylor, like many of us do, and they have a system for kids' books where they can specify the genre or the call number for books that fall outside usual call numbers. That's actually a really great idea. Yeah, so thanks, Jane. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. We also genrefied our juvenile fiction, and we tried genrefying juvenile nonfiction here at the branch, not as successfului, but yeah, we really think about the call numbers. And right now we have a sheet for cataloging juvenile nonfiction that, to make it easier for kids to find materials. And so, but at a certain point, you can't keep changing the call numbers. It's an endless task. But it is good. We worked with Baker and Taylor. We had a bunch of meetings, and they allowed us to put another field in the grid for each title we order. And you can specify genre or call number. And we also use a lot of corporate author cutters for, series and things like that. DC or Marvel or what have you.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Jane. That was great. I see Paula mentioned in the chat that they are in a process of reclassifying young adult materials and also graphic novels. Then, oh, a few more questions. And Paula, feel free to share your experience as well. I feel like reclassifying graphic novels especially is always a huge task. So feel free to share any experience you have with that as well, if you'd like. And then, oh yeah, I like Kelly's question too of stressing the questions of classifying, like how will patrons look for it and find it? That's such a great question. And I think Lisa and Catherine, you both touched upon that as well too, when you were trying to figure out how to reclassify these materials too.
Public services staff have been so helpful to me in all the cataloging projects I've done, because they have sort of a firsthand view of what patrons are struggling with, what patrons are successfully finding, and that really helps me a lot. I do love working with patrons because of the nature of my job. I'm usually in the back on other stuff. So the expertise of public services staff has just been invaluable to me throughout my career.
Great, I agree. As someone who's always worked in the public facing side. Okay, and I see a question from Erin in the chat. A reclassifying adjacent question. I don't have a spine label printer they love. That's a good question. So anyone has any suggestions? She is trying to transfer the juvenile non-fic to a non-Dewey structure, but having issues with fading. So if anyone has any suggestions, feel free to put them in the chat, or we could even share some information afterwards as well. Because I don't have any experience off the top of my head, but if anyone else does, feel free to share in the chat or unmute yourself as well.
Yeah, and I think it's a common problem. It's funny because I was out to lunch with some former coworkers, all at different libraries now, but we all used to work together, and the topic of label printers came up in that discussion while we were having lunch. I think it's a common one, finding the right one.
I think all printers are just, I've never met a printer I liked. And I say this, there's actually a printer behind me that's probably going to start smoking and punish me for that, but.
So I see Paula's follow-up questions. Going from Universal Nonfiction Dewey 741.59 to 3 different kinds of collections. I like this idea because I think things can get so lost in 741 because it's such a huge category. So I really like this idea, Paula, of having graphic, manga, and superhero. So that's going to take a long time, but very worthwhile since patrons can find the materials easier. I completely agree. It'll be great in the long run, definitely. And then Kelly has a question. When graphic novels age, it used to be YA, then the series gets more adult. Oh, we can move the whole series. That's a great question. Yeah, I'm not sure. Like that could go either way. What do you guys think, Lisa and Catherine? I think possibly moving the series, but that's also labor intensive and time and space even too.
Yeah, I think that happens a lot. I mean, not just a graphic novel question. For example, Madeleine L'Engle wrote a whole series about a family where the first book in the series won the Newbery Award for children's literature, but later books about the characters' children are definitely books for adults, like A House Like a Lotus, for example. And as far as I know, most places do still keep the earlier books in the series, which are clearly for children in the children's area, and later books in the adult area. But I'd love to hear if anyone else sort of had other experiences trying to keep the series together for patron experience, or what patrons have said.
Yeah, and I think my experience has been the same. I mean, even with like DVDs and the Harry Potter series, sometimes get split because some of the other ones really aren't meant for children. You know, they're older, and if you don't have we didn't have a YA DVD section, so some of them, might need to go in the adult section. And there's always that, what's the right thing to do? Like, do you move the whole thing into the adult section just because of those other ones? Do you want to keep it? Is it more important to keep them together? I think it is. It's a tough question. I know that we had some with YA books where some of the later ones were in adult.
At least at my library, I think people would have been genuinely surprised if we had A Wrinkle in Time with the adult books. Like that
Right.
would not have been a good decision for patrons. I think people think of that as a children's book that should be easily retrievable by children in the children's area on a lower shelf.
Yeah. Such a good book.
But if someone asks, I'll be like, you know what, she wrote other books about this family, just so you know, and those are in the adult section.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was a great comment. There's also a really nice comment from Nathalie about using a lot of non-specific Dewey numbers. For example, 641.5 for all 10 shelves of cookbooks. Yeah, I feel like cookbooks can be so overwhelming with like, there's so many. So the 641.5s can be like, really just like shelves and shelves.
Yeah.
So that's a really great comment. And now all vegetarian cookbooks are together, all kosher, etc. I like that idea as well. It makes it easy to find things. And I think cookbooks can get really lost among the library's collection as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know we made an effort with that as well, and actually put like the shelf labels for like, this is vegetarian, you know, so we were still using Dewey completely, not doing Glades or genreification or anything like that, but you know, to say like, this is where you're going to find the kosher, this is where you're going to find the, you know, gluten-free, that kind of thing, and just using as much as you can with the Dewey, you know, with spine labels, you know, kind of cutting it a little bit, but I think it does help because cookbooks are really popular. I mean, those go out, but it can be tough to look through everything if it's not, you know, extended more with a built number.
And the assumption is that everything is together on the shelf. And if you don't see any more, then it's because it doesn't exist. That was another reason it was so important for us to reclassify the Holocaust denial books. Sorry to bring back to that, but just because patrons do sort of associate everything on a shelf and assume that, you know, books are together with a book is judged by the company it keeps, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it was very important for us to have shelves of like material to enable the best browsing.
Yeah. Yeah, because a lot of people just browse. I mean, they just do.
It is the most fun way of finding anything.
Definitely.
And often the most helpful if you have physical access to a library.
And I'm sorry that I don't remember who mentioned it, but using, you know, the Marvel DC, you know, in there can help. And I've seen others who've cuttered with, you know, the character. So Spider-Man, all the Spider-Mans can be together, and, you know, the Hulk and etc. So kind of cuttering with the series name, because that is how people look for those kinds of things. I mean, and I think that is kind of what we're discussing at its core. It's, you know, what makes sense for people to find what they need, you know, in the places that actually make sense without abandoning your entire classification system.
Christy asks, how do you classify memoirs that were later revealed to be fiction? That is a great question. And I think one of the best presentations I have ever heard in my entire life was about a cataloger who was studying exactly that issue, the cataloging and classification of false memoirs. I believe, although don't hold me to it because it was a few years ago, but I believe that she came down on the side of classifying them as fiction. Especially for materials where someone was very much taking on an identity that was not their own, like the education of Little Tree, which purports to be a story of a Native American person growing up, but was in fact written by a white person. I believe she and her library reclassified that as fiction as opposed to nonfiction. But yeah, that's a great question. Let me see if I can actually, because I believe she actually published an article about it. Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And thanks, Christy. That is a really good question too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also see Natalie's comment in the chat. This is something I think about a lot as well, having done collection development for this. So she is mentioning that the 300s and 600s, with topics like addiction, medicine, end of life, a lot of patrons don't really know the difference. And these books really are found in both categories. So patrons might not look in both places. So do people have thoughts on this about cataloging specifically these topics? That is a really good question. I definitely see them across the board. Sometimes even in the 900s, depending on how they phrase it. They phrase it as like history. Sometimes even, so they really are across the board with this topic. If you're browsing, you're not going to always find it if you're just looking specifically in one section of the library. And Jenny says that they try to group like topics together, so easier for patrons to find. Yeah, I think we all are afraid of doing it wrong. I completely relate to that as well. Yes, but no cataloging, please. Thank you, Kelly,
Yes.
for that reminder. We needed that. Yes.
That's right.
It was Karen Snow. Apologies, Karen, for
Oh.
not remembering your name. And I'm putting the DOI of her article in Cataloging Classification Quarterly into the chat, just because I want to shout out her work. That was a really great presentation, a really great article.
That's great.
But yes, there is no cataloging police, which is a good thing
Yes.
in a lot of ways.
Yeah. But it is why we need to document, right? Because,
Yes.
you know, like that's.
And even if there were, in the end, you know your patrons best. Like everyone knows their patrons, their institution's patrons best, and what the patron needs. And what my patron needs at Montclair State might not be what a patron needs at Harvard, might not be what a patron needs at, you know, the Escanaba Public Library in Michigan. Different patron populations are going to look for different materials in different ways, and catalogers and librarians adjust to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great reminder. Thanks, Catherine. If anyone else has any questions for Catherine and Lisa, feel free to unmute yourself or put anything in the chat. I'm really loving this chat so far. So many great questions, comments, ideas, resources. It's been wonderful.
I love the idea of cuttering by superhero name, Jane. That
I do
brings me a lot
too.
of pleasure on so many levels.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the things with reclassification projects, like as we've discussed, it goes hand in hand with weeding, and you know they kind of feed each other in a good way, I think, because if you're got some things that aren't circulating and you need to make space, as we all often do, if you're doing a weeding project, it may be the right time to reclassify some things, and if you're in a reclassification, it's definitely a good time to do some weeding.
Oh yes. As someone pointed out in the chat, a lot of other libraries finding this denial material would have thrown it out if they didn't have the same sort of very specific focus we did, and that would have made sense.
Yes. And Patty makes a good point, are they not circulating because they aren't relevant or because someone can't find them? And that is the question, right? Worth trying to have them somewhere else, see if they circ better. And then if not, okay, you got to give it some time.
Yes, thank you, Patty. That was great. Oh, I see. An idea of cutter Disney books by Disney followed by movie to keep them together. I like that idea.
Yeah.
I like the superhero ideas too. So Superman, Batman, etc. And multi-author series. Oh, I like that too. Yeah, this is some really great ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, classifying comics and graphic novels and manga it could easily be a skill share in itself.
Yes.
There are so many great ideas and innovative things people are doing in that field.
Yeah, definitely. That could be its own presentation. So I'll look into that, see if I can make that happen too.
Definitely.
There's so many good ideas, depending on your community. So that'd be great.
Yeah.
I had one question to throw out if we have time.
Yes.
So I'm finding that I'm a children's librarian, and I'm finding that there's like a fine line now sometimes with some picture books that could easily go in picture books under fiction, but then occasionally there's some where it's like, would it be better off in parenting? And then sometimes if I see certain picture books aren't going out and they're on my weeding list, sometimes I'll put them in parenting to see if they can find a home there. But I feel like it's a tough call sometimes, and especially if it's something pertaining to like diversity, then it ends up worrying me, like, am I segregating the books on this topic by putting them in parenting? But I want, like, I don't want to get rid of some of them if they feel like they're a good topic. I'm just wondering if anybody else is struggling with this.
Yeah, I can see there are some picture books on that clearly go in parenting. I don't want to swear in this, but Go to F to Sleep is a good example of one that probably shouldn't be in the children's area.
That's in our adult parenting, so.
Yes. But no, that is a good question about when books go from sort of the children's area to the adults, to the adult. When is a book more for parents to share with children, and when is a book one that would probably be easier for children to find for themselves? That is an interesting question.
It's especially because we split our parenting into two sections, where one is sort of like baby names, like anything that an adult would be reading on their own. And then we have picture books that, you know, if a parent's looking for issues on the topic of like sharing, or, you know, because there are picture books where it's technically fiction, but it tackles sharing or whatever issue, social emotional learning, in an approachable way. And then sometimes we have parents coming in to look for that, and it feels, you know, is it better to have them all grouped in parenting under, like, we did a sort of a rough non-Dewey structure with like parenting, kids, feelings, and that way we'd be able to say, here's all the books, instead of being like, okay, they're all over because they're all under different authors. So I don't know. I just feel like I second guess it. So I was curious if anybody else had the issue.
We've definitely had parents come in and ask for children's books on a given topic, for example, a new baby or a divorce. Usually I point them towards looking for doing a subject search in the catalog, just because the way that our juvenile collection was organized, although it was purchased for, at my previous institution, it was purchased for the use of education students, but it was still low to the ground so that children could also use it. And it was not easily browsable by anyone who was over, 4 feet tall. So that was another aspect, just how difficult it was for adults to browse in our children's section. But like I said, this was a children's section that was very unusual because it was an academic library.
I actually usually defer to the children's librarians whenever I have a question of, when a children's book comes in and it's purchased as biography, but it's clearly a picture book with minimal biographical content. It does mention that it's a life of whoever the subject is, but I always defer to them. They know best whether it's going to circulate better in picture book or in a biography section. So
yeah, thank you for that perspective. I also like a comment in the chat about, as a children's librarian, it can be difficult, it can be a struggle to find the right classification for children's fiction books that also contain information, making it possibly nonfiction. I agree, having been there. Like Linda said, it really is a judgment call, and thankfully there are now cataloging police. So I agree with what everyone else was kind of saying earlier, like, you know your community best. I would say do what works best for where your community can find these books on the shelves. If anyone else has any questions for Lisa or Catherine, we're happy to, answer them. But I also wanted to say thank you all for being here and asking all these great questions and staying with us as we went a few minutes over. So this was so great. I definitely want to have a follow-up to this because we had so many great ideas. So maybe just one, graphic novels, especially, I'm thinking to start, and we have the gender one next month. So I will be in touch with all these links and resources. And any questions, feel free to reach out to Lisa or Catherine. I'll put their information in the follow-up email. You're welcome to email them at any time with ideas, suggestions. And thank you everyone for being here. It was great.
Thank you so much. It was great talking with everyone, and I loved all your ideas.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. And I'm going to plug NJLA Technical Services and Collection Development section. If you like having these conversations, they meet one Friday morning a month. So check that out.
Awesome. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Catherine.
you.
And thank you, everyone.